This is Professor McDonald. This will be some comments on Chapter 6, Basic Investigative Leads and Informants. This is a comprehensive chapter, very important chapter for anybody that has the avocation or wishes to become a criminal investigator. A lot of what you're going to read about in this chapter is the essence of what criminal investigation is all about and the duties that you will perform as a criminal investigator. I like the way they start the chapter off because cases and investigations are pretty simple. When an individual is either caught in the act or shortly thereafter, let's say somebody walks in and robs a liquor store and the police are outside and they quickly catch him. Well, there's not a lot of cloudiness as to who did it, because you know who did it and you've already caught the person. But many times that's not the way it works. And they talk about known identity and unknown identity, and in either case, the bottom line is this: once a crime has occurred, and if you're the investigator that's assigned to investigate this crime, then you will begin a process of generating what are called basic leads that should hopefully lead you to a suspect and ultimately to a prosecution. And that's what criminal investigators do. This also ties in a little bit with our first discussion board, because you were asked to, I gave you a scenario with a homicide scenario, and you were asked to develop some leads as to how to identify a suspect in that case. And just as many of you mentioned, the first initial basic lead in any case is the victim themselves. If the victim is alive, then obviously you'll have an opportunity to interview that victim and generate information that will develop additional leads from that victim interview. If the victim is deceased, such as in a murder case, the victim can't speak to you, but the crime scene can speak to you. And so the crime scene will be one of the focal points where you will generate leads based on the evidence that is recovered at the scene. Now, this is notwithstanding eyewitnesses or witnesses of any sort. There's a long list of potential leads that emanate from your typical criminal investigation. I like the fact that the book talks about hunches. As an experienced investigator myself, I never relied on hunches. I always felt or intuition. I always felt that you follow the evidence and you follow it to wherever it leads. Because if you start investigating cases based on hunches, you're going to end up going in circles, and there's a lot of cases that you should solve that you won't solve. So again, follow the evidence, follow it where it leads. And if you do that and you do your job properly, you'll solve a lot of cases. Now, they talk about known identity and unknown identity. Obviously, if you have somebody that you believe is the suspect in the case, your job will be to generate leads to corroborate maybe the story of an eyewitness or other evidence that leads to that particular individual. In cases of unknown identity, the objective is to develop suspects by following the basic investigative leads. So sometimes you'll have a suspect when you start out, but you don't want to put blinders on. Even if you have a good suspect, you want to make sure that the information that you get is verified and validated. You still have to develop evidence. You still have to do an investigation, even when you have a pretty good idea who did it. You still got to prove that that person did it, and you'll have to follow investigative leads to get there. And again, in those cases of unknown identity, your leads are going to initially be developed in such a manner as to help you identify who the perpetrator of the crime is. And they talk about a lot of different leads. Obviously, you want to investigate the victim's background. You want to look at the benefit, what individual could benefit from the crime itself. In some homicides, we had a homicide case. Well, it wasn't a homicide case, but it could have easily been one where a wife took out a contract on her husband. He was a postal employee. And fortunately, the individual that she took out the contract with reported it to the local police, and we were able to work the case from there, and he was not murdered. But again, she was the one that was going to benefit. Sometimes people will kill people or burn their house for insurance money. Figuring out who's going to benefit is a viable lead, along with opportunity. Who has the opportunity to commit the crime? They talk about alibis. In other words, if a suspect emerges, if he has an alibi that he can prove that he was somewhere else and not involved with the crime, you still have to investigate it, though. Just because they say they have an alibi, you need to verify that. Who has the knowledge? Sometimes with embezzlement cases and armed robbery, do we have people that have had access to the premises, people that are familiar with the security procedures at a particular location? We had a homicide case at Camp Lejeune where a sergeant murdered a lance corporal, and the sergeant had been fired. He worked part-time on the weekends at the golf course. The golf course was called Paradise Point, and he had been fired because he just wasn't a good employee. They didn't trust him. And a lance corporal had come in, and the person, it was a large golf course. He actually had his bed there. He stayed there, and that was his assignment. Well, this sergeant snuck in one night to try to burglarize the safe, and excuse me. And what he did, they had changed the combination after they'd fired him. So the lance corporal surprised him. He forced the lance corporal to open the safe. There was a struggle. Ultimately, the sergeant murdered the lance corporal and then took his body and dumped it in the New River, which is a major river. It was found a few days later. We knew we had a homicide because I was one of the first people that went to the crime scene, and I've never seen that much blood. So it was a violent engagement. But again, this was knowledge. This individual had a knowledge of of where the money was kept, and unfortunately, in this case, they probably would have been better off had they not changed the combination. Maybe he would have got in and stole the $400 or $500, and the lance corporal would still be alive. But nonetheless, you have people that are former employees, people that are service and maintenance people. These are all people that have knowledge of an area. The police file field contact reports. A lot of times those are great. They can generate leads as well. Vehicles are very useful. A lot of times vehicles are used in commission of crimes, and even things like partial license plates can be tracked, and individuals' leads can be generated from those plate numbers, and suspects can be identified. So again, these are all things that you as an investigator will be following up on. Sometimes you'll actually, when I was in NCIS, we used to send out leads to other offices too. If we were working an investigation and we needed something followed up at another office, you would send a lead there, and an investigator at that office would go out and do the interview or whatever it might be. I worked on a few cases that where I was assigned a simple investigative lead to interview somebody, and then it turned out to be a major breakthrough sometimes in the case. You just interview the right person that might have information on a crime. So sometimes the smallest leads can turn out to be very important. Weapons. Obviously, those are leads. If you recover firearms at a crime scene, you have serial numbers that can be traced, makers' names. You would be surprised of some of the tracing capability. I worked on a case once where we actually were able to trace a particular bottle of alcohol to a particular store in an area, in a general area. So you would be surprised of the capability to trace certain items that may be useful to you in your investigation. Fingerprints are great because we have computerized fingerprint systems now where they can do rapid scanning of thousands of fingerprints at one time. So if you're able to recover fingerprints at a crime scene. Stolen property, those, if you know if it was a burglary or robbery, and you know you have property that is traceable and identifiable, those are great leads to follow up. Many pawn shop proprietors in various cities are very cooperative with the police, and investigators can go in and check their records and try to identify items. And again, these have got to be items that can be identifiable, something that is unique to that item, whether it be a serial number or even a particular description of a specialized piece of jewelry, things of this nature. A lot of police departments have access to computerized stolen property record systems, so they keep a computerized stolen property record system, and you can access that as well. But I have had luck with these pawn shops, and they are more than willing to help. Now, you could have some bad pawn shops that are knowingly taking items that they know are stolen, but for the most part, we have found them to be cooperative. At least I have in my experiences. But these, again, are leads that are generated. The modus operandi of a crime is the choice of is kind of how a person commits their crime. It's kind of their signature. And so the manner in which they commit crime. I think we talked about that, maybe not in this class, but with certain serial killers. They have a certain manner in which they murder people. The BTK killer, he would bind, torture, and kill. Ted Bundy, he had a knack. His MO was to try to pick up young women. He was an attractive young man. He would try to pick up young women. Sometimes he would act as if he was injured. He might even have a crutch, something like that, to try to get them to help him get into a car or whatever. So that would be his method of operation. Some burglars have a certain way that they burglarize buildings to try, or even how to crack safes. So these are all called methods of operation. Maybe even the way they enter a building. Maybe they like to go in through the roof and cut a hole and drop themselves down in. Maybe they steal the entire safe. I've seen that with burglary rings. Rather than try to crack a safe inside a building, they try to steal the entire safe out of the building if they can. So these, again, are methods of operation of how criminals operate. And they can tell you a lot. A lot of police departments keep a record system on particular MOs. Some bombers have signatures. And I worked on a case once where an ATF, it was a bomb case, the one that killed a federal judge. They recovered a couple of devices, and there was an ATF forensic bomb guy who recognized the signature, the way that bomb was made, because he had seen it before. It was relatively unique, and that lead led to the identification of the suspect in the bombings. Now, in addition, and I've used this quite often too, is the use of photographs. They call them mugshots of individuals. And if you have a suspect where you have eyewitnesses that can identify that suspect, there are multiple ways to use photographs. You can do what they call a photographic lineup, and actually, I've got a film that you're gonna require viewing relative to a computer system that was developed to conduct photographic lineups. In the book, they say 5 or 10 suspects in a photo lineup when you show it to. But there's a process to go through, and it used to be they would lay them out, but now what they do is they put them down one at a time. Everything with identification now is under scrutiny, because there have been that's one area of criminal investigation where you can make errors, where people misidentify people. So you have to be very cautious in conducting photographic lineups, physical lineups, making sure that the witness is not prejudiced in some way to have them pick out the wrong person, maybe because they want to please you, the investigator, and the way you handle it. So you have to be very, very careful. And that's why I've included some clips on those particular. But just for this chapter, just know this, that there are mug books where victims and witnesses can go through and try to help identify potential suspects. And maybe it's not the exact suspect that they identify, but maybe somebody that resembles that person. And that's a good lead, because now if you have a possible description on a suspect, you can move forward in trying to identify who that person is. So again, be very careful, and you'll be trained as a criminal investigator, because the one thing you don't want to do is prejudice an individual where their future testimony can be compromised. And they do talk about that a little bit in using photographic lineups. Now, don't steer away from them, because they are an excellent investigative tool in identification. I've used them many times, and if they're done properly and in the way you're trained properly, they can be very beneficial in identifying a suspect. Along with they really don't spend a lot of time talking about physical lineups in this particular textbook, but those can be the same way. Where you actually wouldn't look at a photograph, you would actually, the witness would observe an individual who is a lineup of individuals in an attempt to actually identify the individual who they believe is the person that committed the crime. Identikit is another way to, and I was trained in that when I was an NCIS agent, where you come up with kind of a composite sketch of what an individual looks like. You also can use police artists. I've seen some of their work, and I think it's really good. Another good lead is if you have a crime where violence has occurred, a homicide, an assault, an arson case, or somebody could be bloodied or burned. One of the best leads is to notify the local hospitals, because these people sometimes, and they will, show up to get treated. And so your suspect might walk into the local hospital, and if they've been notified in advance, they'll give you a call, and you can go and respond to the hospital and interview the individual that came in for treatment. Now, it might turn out that that's not the right person, but you never know, because there have been multiple cases through the years where injured suspects have turned themselves in for treatment in a local hospital, and they were later identified as a suspect in a case. You're always looking to identify not only the suspect and any partners in crime, those linkages between individuals. I mean, in a conspiracy, say, to rob a bank, you might have the individuals that go inside to rob the bank. You got a getaway driver. You might have somebody that works in the bank that's provided information on when the best time to rob the bank is, these sort of things. So trying to establish those linkages is very, very important. Social media is a great way to identify people. The important thing that people don't realize is that information that's posted to a social networking site is fair game for anyone, including the investigator. Once you publicly disclose that, you lose your expectation of privacy. So I know multiple investigators and probation officers that are trying to track individuals that have been successful, that have done this successfully using social media. Video surveillance is also very useful. They have pictures of the Boston bombings in the textbook. And today there's cameras everywhere, and so take advantage of those opportunities. Cell phones. Once investigators get legal access to a phone, you have forensic analysis of the phone, just like you can get forensic analysis of laptop computers. And you can pull a lot of useful information. So those are great leads to follow up on. Let me just talk briefly about informants. Informants also have long been a source of information to investigators. And I'll be honest with you, if you're going to be an effective criminal investigator, you need to have informants. And in some agencies, you're required to have informants. And registered informants that provide you information. So, I mean, your informant it's not always some character some sleazy guy hanging down on the corner, your typical stereotype informant. I mean, your informant could be a professional businessman that works in a business location that you never know when that person could be a guy at a drugstore or a 7-Eleven, somebody that can provide information to you at a critical time. So if you should, my advice to you is, you should develop informants, and because they're very useful. The information they can provide can solve a lot of cases. And they, in the book, people have a tendency to think it's dirty business, but it might be a dirty business, but crime is a dirty business too. So I never had any regrets in the informants that I used to solve cases. But you got to watch them, you got to manage them. That's critical. They have to be properly managed. They talk about different types of informants. I'm not going to read all those to you. Let me just mention them just briefly. You have a participant informant who's somebody maybe in a drug scene who's been picked up maybe for a minor possession charge, and rather than being prosecuted, he decides to flip and provide information to the police. You have covert informants, and these are you can find these in agencies like the CIA and the FBI that are involved in providing information about terrorist or other criminal organizations from positions of trust and confidence within groups. And they call them moles in international espionage. And you can believe me, from an international espionage level, that the Russians, the Chinese, and other adversaries of the United States, or competitors, let's say, not adversaries, they have covert informants that are working in this country as I speak here. Accomplice witnesses, these are people that maybe were involved in the crime themselves and they've agreed to cooperate, maybe for a reduced charge or whatever. And I've used these many times in cases and found them to be very, very useful. I've used accomplice witnesses to work and develop information on other targets within the investigation, and also have used them to introduce undercover agents or inspectors into criminal conspiracies. And then you move that person out of the way, and now you've got a police officer that's within the organization. That's the best possible result that you can have in dealing with informants. And these people will be wired. I mean, they'll secretly record information. The whole point being is you're trying to develop information to convict criminals. They talk about surveillance. I'm not going to. Those are pretty easy to follow. You're going to do a lot of surveillance work when you're a police officer, especially if you're a criminal investigator. And it could be visual, fixed. I've done all of these that are listed here, and you will learn how to do that. Your agency, wherever you go, will teach you in proper surveillance techniques. And I've taught these overseas to police officers when I was working with the State Department. These were police organizations that were investigating terrorist organizations within their countries. GPS, yes, you can put GPS on and tracking vehicles, but in Jones versus the U.S., the Supreme Court has said before you can use a GPS device, you have to get a warrant. Audio surveillance, many different types. Some people, they call it bugging, whatever. You have the type where the person, you actually surreptitiously enter an establishment, place listening devices within, say, a person's, that's the target in their home, and then you monitor the conversations and record those conversations. You need a warrant to do that. They talk a little bit about the Dahlia case in the sense that the Supreme Court does allow a person, if they're going to bug an individual, maybe somebody involved in organized crime or whatever, and the FBI or whatever agency's working a case has to actually secretly go into that facility or to that person's business and place the recording devices. That's okay. They get that, and they don't have a problem with that. But to put that device in, you do have to have a warrant. The covert entry part of it doesn't have to be a separate warrant. You still have to, again, they talk about the Katz case. You should have studied that, and perhaps in criminal law. And that essentially established that if you're going to have a bug or an audio, if you're going to record an audio conversation through a listening device, that's placed at a location, you need a warrant. In that case, in the Katz case, he was a gambler taking bets across state lines. He went to a phone booth, the old phone booth, and the FBI put a bug outside the phone booth and recorded his conversations. And the Supreme Court said that man has when he goes inside that, even though the bug was right outside the phone booth, there's an expectation of privacy for that person. And so therefore that was an unreasonable search and seizure. So from that moment on, anytime you put a bugging device, even in a public area, like what had happened in the Katz case, you have to secure a warrant. Now, if you're sitting at McDonald's and somebody admits to you in the booth next to you that they just killed somebody, well, there's no expectation of privacy there. But if you're going to place a recording device in a public area or in a person's phone, you do need to get a warrant. There is one exception to that, that's called participant monitoring, and I've done this many times, and that's where you have a cooperating or a accomplice witness, and you have them make a phone call, or even an undercover officer make a phone call to the target and record that conversation. If you have one party that agrees to record a conversation, then you don't need a warrant. Now, when I did this in the cases that I did, we did have to get authorization from the Department of Justice before we did this, and I did this many times. The next area I want to talk about a little bit is the intelligence area. I want you to make sure you're familiar with the stages of the police intelligence process. I actually teach an intelligence studies class. If you have an opportunity, I highly recommend you take it. Intelligence is the lifeblood today. Information, you can't get enough. And these stages are very important. It talks about how information gets into the system, how it's collected, how it's evaluated, how it's analyzed, how it's disseminated, reevaluated. And as a criminal investigator, most federal agencies and most large departments have an intelligence unit, people that are trained in analysis, and you're the requester. You're the person that has a need, and maybe you need information on a gang operation, and you give them the requirement, which would be, hey, what information can you tell me about the ABC gang? And they'll go about collecting information to help provide you a report as to what they can find out about that particular gang. Very vital to proactive investigative work. In my counterterrorism strategies class, we do link analysis. And this is where you link relationship between people and organizations. It's a powerful, powerful tool. I teach them how to chart these techniques, and it's a lot of fun in the classroom. And this is another investigative lead type activity that's very good. Lineups, I won't read all these to you. You have the photographic lineup, what I talked about. They say 4 to 6. For any test, I'll use that number, but I wouldn't give one with less than 6. I usually use 6 to 8 when I was doing it, and you can read about. You can't, if your suspect is a white male, you can't put a white male's photograph in there with 5 black males. Obviously, that would not be a legitimate lineup. Physical lineups are just like very similar to what you see on television. They say 4 to 6 persons here again. I would never use less than 6, but for testing purposes, 4 to 6 is fine. What they're doing now is, and I've got a tape that I required viewing. Rather than putting all 6 there, they bring them in one at a time. These are all things to try to make sure reduce the opportunity for people to select the wrong person and have somebody get convicted for a crime they didn't commit based on a misidentification. You can also force people to speak during identification. Now, the defendant does have a right to an attorney during the lineups themselves. The field lineup, also another term for that is called a show-up. I never liked it. This is kind of a one-on-one deal where a crime just occurred and they bring the witness to where the suspect is and say, hey, is that the guy? To me, that's kind of prejudice, but there could be a situation where that could occur, I could see. And the courts have upheld these type of lineups. But let's say you have a person that's wounded, or he's severely wounded, he might not be going to make it, and you have a suspect, and you bring that suspect before that person, before he gets transported to the hospital for identification. I wouldn't have a problem with that, because that's kind of an emergency situation that you're facing. But anyway, this chapter's got a lot of good stuff in it, so make sure you take your time in reading it, and I hope this tape has helped a little bit. End of dictation.